we're in species that copy one another. We copy how to talk, how to open doors. And it's not that much of a leap to say we also copy what to want.
What contains all these decisions are basically a system of like living, and I think people hide behind these systems because they're scared of being like themselves. I think perhaps people that hide behind conformity, that hide behind systems, are people that actually don't know who they are themselves.
A topic that has been kind of playing out behind the scenes, which is the response to Douglas Murray on Joe Rogan. It's kind of cheap to say things, but it's expensive to rebut things.
He's telling stories about what happened during the Second World War. But then he says, well, I'm not an historian. How do we regulate podcasts in a way that they can't sort of spin off to like very anti-social?
Do you really think that? Hey, this is a impromptu episode of Metaphysical Graffiti. Sam and I just felt like having a chat, so here you go.
There's a book that I've got called Wanting by a guy called Luke Bourgeois, I think it is. I can't remember. Do you know him? He's a student of Rene Girard, and he mentions spiritual in the book. But yeah, it's about how human want things, how human wants are based on mimetic desires ultimately, which is obviously very Girardian. Yeah, it's good. I've got it if you want me to lend it to you.
I think conceptually it's pretty easy to understand, right? We're in species that copy one another. We copy how to talk, how to open doors, how to be a mother and a father, how to be in a relationship. And it's not that much of a leap to say we also copy what to want from one another. And I think it's maybe a mark of someone who's really done a lot of like work on themselves, or is someone who's like kind of in a way a cut above the cloth, is to step out of copying what other people want and to really sit down and be like, what do I actually want? Not as a consequence of the society I'm in. You know, I love this kind of idea where it's like, you know, I've met both people who really like aggressively pursue the corporate route, and then people who are like, well, you're just doing that because, you know, that's what you think is the only option. I'm going to do something really contrarian. I'm going to go work at a startup. But in a way, there's kind of going to work at a startup has become the mainstream contrarian thing to do, and in of itself has become kind of mainstream again, you know? So even when you think you're necessarily being outside of that window of what you think everyone wants, you can still be highly conformist. So yeah, it's basically like a conformist contrarian. And I actually think the bigger problem is not necessarily just mimetic desire. I actually think it's just conformity in general. And I think one negative thing that the internet has brought about is if you're within your social group, you don't want to be too much of an outlier. You don't want to be someone, you know, within your tight circle of friends, someone who has like wildly different views, like completely outside the shared almost narrative of that group. And I think what's happened is as we've exposed more people to more people through the internet, the capacity to be conformist has skyrocketed. And I think a lot of like the political culture of the 2010s that we saw was actually like people strangely falling into lockstep at scale about things they didn't even necessarily agree on or believe in. And it's just this like broad scale conformity and that has led to ultimately what we want to talk about today a little bit, which is the role of experts and the complete collapse of society's trust in experts. And it's almost like expertise in and of itself becoming a negative signal that, oh, this person's an expert in something. But I would argue it's not just, the experts have been cowards on one hand, but on the other hand, like we kind of have been in this broad situation where if you're a virologist expert and someone says to you, oh, you're really racist to say that this virus came from a lab, you know, and then you shut up about it. You don't say it because the broader culture is not in a place where it allows you to really be an honest expert. And you also don't have the courage, quite frankly, to risk your job, to risk everything um, to do that, then of course people start to question expertise, because you start to have things like, I'm not making a value judgment here. I'm just saying things like, on one hand, experts saying, 2 meters, stay away from everyone, then signing an open letter saying protesting in the street is fine from a virological perspective because the political cause they're marching for is valid. That's how the expertise undermines itself. I think that's the pathway that's led to such a backlash against experts. I actually think it's a consequence ultimately of the political moment we've been through in the last 10, 15 years.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because I think part of the reason why we distrust experts as well is for the same reason why we distrust, I guess, other people when they're necessarily conforming to other narratives or cultures or I don't know how you describe the examples that you gave of someone like choosing their career path of like whether they're working in a big corp or in startup environment. Is that what would encapsulate that? I guess career, I suppose the conforming in terms of career choices and things. Is that basically what these decisions are made up of, or basically what contains all these decisions are basically a system of like living. And I think people hide behind these systems because they're scared of being like themselves and too authentic. They're scared of basically, Jordan Peterson gave this example once where he basically said that there's a group of scientists that basically went to Africa and they went to do some experiments on mammals, on zebras, and they couldn't. They were following one zebra, but they couldn't figure out which zebra it was. The second day that they came back, they were like, "Oh, what zebra was that?" Because obviously all zebras look the same, and so they came up with an ingenious idea of marking the zebra's butt with a big red dot, and they were like, "Right, sure enough, that's a zebra. That's the one that we're tracking. Okay, great." They came back the third day, and that zebra was dead. And basically what happened was that the lion had been able to distinguish the zebra from the pack because of the red dot. So therefore, that was the zebra that they honed in on, focused on, locked their gaze on, and basically tracked it down and killed it. And the reason why zebras have black and white stripes isn't to disguise themselves in the environment, because obviously that's not what the environment looks like, but it's to disguise themselves among the pack, because when you see a bunch of zebras in the same pack, you can't make out like one individual zebra unless you mark it with the big red dot, and then you can distinguish a zebra from a pack. So it's an analogy for basically there's safety in numbers, but there's also safety in conforming and being like everyone else, because you're not going to be very easily distinguishable, and you're not going to be a target to lions. And I think that basically what humans have done in the most abstract way is basically create systems where we're all able to conform. And obviously the thing that I find most special about human beings is that we're all so unique, and we're also special in our own way. And that should be shouted about and celebrated. But yet, it's
all the social pressures on conformity.
Exactly. That's the last thing that people want to do, is like to really be themselves. And it's that, I don't know, that.
But do you think that's, I wonder if it's like this something that ebbs and flows? Is the desire or the capacity to be individualistic just not in vogue right now? Because if you're really like heterodox and you're really kind of out of the crowd, the risks are really high right now, right? Like in the first few years of the internet, we're kind of coming into mass social media probably around 2012, kind of critical mass. And then everything kind of went haywire in 2014 to 2016. We sort of built up a lot of like, I feel like we're starting to now, but like build up a lot of culture around the internet. But like if you're really yourself online, the cost could be enormous. Like you can get doxxed, you can get people finding out all sorts of horrible things about you. So I genuinely think like the internet has been like a conformity machine that's just caused everyone to look at the person next to them, or the person 10,000 miles away from them, but is right on their phone, and see that they're behaving differently, And that urge to conform, to be that zebra, kicks in, and they end up kind of dropping whatever it was that made them unique. I love your point about systems as well and people hiding behind systems. I think this is one thing that, because the way that my brain is constructed, I find uniquely frustrating. And that is, I mean, one is kind of like overly bureaucratic systems in general. But two, it's people justifying incompetence or poor decision making, ignorance. It's ignorance actually as well. That's a really good one. That's a fundamental problem in general with like, oh, well, I'm just following the process, And to steelman bureaucracy, the best form of bureaucracy is basically taking the system of thought that the most competent person who could do that task would execute to execute that task, and systematizing it and processifying it in such a way that people less competent than that person can execute as if they were as competent as that person. The problem as it breaks down is that when it's too resistant to update, because the task that you may have had in mind may have shifted because the underlying reality has changed when things change over time. But the system itself is resistant to being updated, partly because of inertia, partly because of scale, partly because of risk, partly just because of fear of change in general, I would say. And yeah, I mean, this is an interesting thing I've noticed in my travels to Germany, is that Germans are really good at following the process, but very few Germans question whether or not, this is a bloody big generalization, by the way. But it's just like something I've noticed, like in small interactions in airports, on trains and things, there's a system and everyone follows the system very rigidly, but there's no kind of cultural space to question whether or not this is the right way of doing something, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
And to be fair, like if all the systems were really well thought out and had an update mechanism, that would be probably one of the most successful societies on earth, because everyone, regardless of level of competence, would conform to the system and execute the most competent way possible, regardless of their individual competence level, in my conceptualization of the steelman case of bureaucracy. But the problem is when it comes to a point where you don't have that update mechanism, you don't have the capacity to change the system, and then you're stuck, I would say. And so I don't know what it's kind of like asking, how would things be different if everyone was the best version of themselves all the time? Yeah. I think but I guess this ties into the conformity point, right? Like people conform to what they see as a system because we're attracted to structure naturally. But then occasionally you have minds that inherently dislike structure, inherently dislike being managed. And those are the people who I think maybe have some perspective on how to update systems or kind of look at things from the outside, but they're not convenient people to have around all the time, because you need people to.
I reckon it's the same people that like the structure when there's no structure, but when there's too much structure, they're the biggest advocates against, more structure and for more rule breaking or caveats to certain rules and exceptions and things like that. I think everyone within them has this divide where they want to be on the line between order and chaos, basically. And I think that that's what everyone is striving for, is to like be perfectly within that line. I think perhaps people that hide behind conformity, that hide behind systems, are people that actually don't know who they are themselves. They've not figured out who it is that they are. And so what they're looking to do is maybe look for a system or look for a group or look for a structure that they can basically join and be absorbed into, and hoping that through that they'll be able to form some sense of identity. But then what happens is that when they're being digested and they're in the bowels of that system and they're basically in it so deep, what they find is like actually they are eager to get out because they've actually lost themselves. They've lost who they are again. They've lost the thing that made them want to search that identity, and they're now assuming a completely different role, a completely different character. And so what they want to do is basically sort of rid themselves of this new system that has absorbed them and consumed them, and they want to leave and separate and sort of look at it again from the outside and think, oh, like I like some of that, but I didn't like that. And they sort of like become not who they were, but they've got part of what they were in them once they've left. So they basically go through this whole change of absorbing themselves into a new culture and a new system. They then sort of realize when they're in it too deep that actually it's not for them. They're perhaps losing themselves, and so they come out of it. But they've retained a lot of like basically what they've of what they experienced, and it's still part of them. But they're now mature, and they're now like a sort of like leveled up human being because they've gone through that. And I think that cycle sort of happens lots of times. And I think the best way to describe that sort of cycle is basically like a phoenix, or like someone that sort of like is reborn. So they're immediately born out into the world, and then they're sort of maturing, and as they mature, they assume an identity, or they assume a certain I don't know, personality, or like I don't know, whatever characteristics, and then they sort of have to shed this off again. They have to like sort of like shed it off and sort of burn all the deadwood, but not all of it is completely 100% gone. Some of it is retained, and through that, a new person and a new version of themselves is emerged, and then that cycle continues. And I think like I think that's what people do in general in their life is, and I'm certainly uh, a good example of this as someone who I can definitely think of phases in my life where I wanted to be a certain person, and then I've sort of like grown out of that. But part of it is still with me. A big good example of this is when I was in high school. I really wanted to be like Liam Gallagher. I thought he was like the coolest human being on earth, and I wanted to buy like long parkas, and I wanted to have my hair like him and wear sunglasses everywhere I went. So I thought I was him, and I used to like swagger about thinking like, oh yeah, I could be Liam Gallagher. But then I sort of grew out of that, and then when I was at uni, I used to think that I could be like Conor McGregor because I was really into like BJJ and like martial arts, and I was like going to the gym. I was like, oh, maybe I could be like him, and I was like sort of like assuming these sort of like pseudo identities of who I thought I could be, and I think in one way that I could describe that as like sort of conforming to like a certain image or idea of who I am. But then if you were to ask me, Sam, do you think you're being yourself? I totally would have said yes.
Yeah.
It's just weird that sort of like contradiction there. Whereas I'm sort of mimicking someone, or like feeling like I'm really part of this whole group. But if you were to ask me, Sam, are you being your authentic self by doing this? I totally would have said yeah. And so, and I think that people who don't know who they are and that are outside of like any sort of societal norms, or very much outside of um any sort of like cohesive culture or group, or any identity that can be attributed to like a group of people, and you put them in a social situation and you ask them, hey, are you being yourself? They totally would say no. They'd be like, no, I'm not. I'm conforming. I'm being someone who I'm not. And it's because I think that they've not got that level of maturity yet where they're able to understand that actually what it means to be human means to assume an identity when you're sort of like in someone. And that's where like the word like persona comes from, is that sort of mask that you put on when you're being who you are. And
Is the person you are at work you?
yeah, and
Yes.
my answer to that is it's totally yes. And is and
But is the person you are around your friends you? Those are two different people. It's kind of a reductive question, isn't it?
yeah,
Because nobody is the same person around everyone. But no, I love your point there.
same in the sense of I'm being as authentic as I possibly feel like I am being.
I mean, there are definitely points in which you're decidedly not yourself, right? And I think depending on your level of self-consciousness, that gives you more or less just like existential angst. If you feel like you're fundamentally acting at odds with your personality, I feel like if you're a person with agency, you don't let the situation continue for very long. Whereas some people, I think, would be willing to put up with that for more time.
Well, I have with that, which I've thought about and which does trouble me, is like which person would you rather be? Because I think the person with higher agency, it sounds like a much more troubled human being, and probably more like upset with themselves when they feel like they're not being themselves, and they will think that they're not being themselves. But the person who's not got that high agency, that isn't sort of self-aware about the things that they're doing that maybe aren't typical of their own traits, is not thinking about that, and they're just happy living life. And
this is the midwit meme, right?
the what?
The midwit meme,
I
where it's like a bell curve. There's like a dumb person, a middle person, and a smart person. And the people on both sides are having like all this angst, and like the guy in the middle is just like, you know, he's not thinking about it too much. He's um, it's a great question. It's like, is there like a point of intelligence that's like self-defeating because you just end up like in a neurotic
Diminishing
mess
return.
of, yeah. In a way, yes and no. I mean, our society's, as we've discussed, stratified itself on intellectual grounds pretty much. Just like raw intellectual horsepower mixed with kind of agency is the kind of two things of society economically values right now. But
Yeah.
to a degree, like, I don't know, there's also like really smart people who just burn out and just smoke weed on the couch all day and kind of, they're kind of too good for everyone, or they've never had to put any effort in and therefore never felt their effort's been rewarded. And by the way, before we move on, I do want to redeem my point about Germany by making a positive point about Germany that came to me. And this is that the Germans have figured out how to, the German speaking peoples, let's say, have in the past figured out this point about overly systematic ways of executing things. And it's Prussian marching orders, where I'm not sure you've heard about Prussian marching orders, but basically, like, military orders can be oblique or they can be very specific, right? You can say to someone, you need to take 20 men, walk up that hill, shoot 10 bullets into the window, and then capture the building, and then, give like highly specific didactic kind of like orders. But what the Prussians realized, arguably one of the most successful military cultures, not positive or negative, just, very, very successful martial culture, they figured out is you got to give oblique orders, and allow the facts on the ground to inform how those orders are executed. So it'll be a general order like capture the building at the top of the hill, and then you leave it to the competent people below you to figure it out. And this is something I've heard is the case at Elon Musk's companies, where there's actually very little like management. It basically the concept is you hire really smart people and you give them like oblique goals, and you trust that they're A, motivated, and B, competent to figure it out.
Well, this is the key difference, actually, and that's what Napoleon did as well, because Napoleon was the first army general that basically segmented his armies into even further smaller groups. I forgot what he called them, but he basically separated them further, so they're even in smaller groups, so they're much more mobile, and they gave them the same sort of general direction as well. And what was going through my head was basically, and you made the point as well about Elon Musk's company, and I was going to make that point as well, is about the difference between how companies structure goal setting. So like one company would set OKRs versus another company that does KPIs. And like traditionally KPIs was the sort of like structure imposed by companies onto the workforce. So basically what a KPI is a key performance indicator. So this is basically saying, look, this is the goal that we want to get to. Now the KPIs are going to basically show the incremental steps that we need to take in order to achieve that goal. So if we want to achieve X, then we need to make sure that we've completed Y, completed B, and completed C. And how you're marking against A, B, and C will be the KPI. So it'll be indicating the performance of the incremental sort of micro steps in order to achieve that main goal. But then what modern companies tend to do is they set OKRs, which is basically the objectives and key results. So what are we actually looking to achieve on an outcome level? And then they basically tell that to their workforce, and they're like, now teams figure it out. You guys know your markets best. You guys know what the sort of the landscape looks like. This is what we're aiming for. We want you guys to essentially like figure it out, and that's down to like the sort of like front lines with the sales team that are essentially tasked with like trying to achieve those OKRs. And I completely agree with your point. Like that is a much more efficient method of trying to achieve an outcome rather than trying to control the whole process of achieving their end result by setting these sort of incremental like micro steps and making sure that they're all achieved. Because ultimately, one is able to account for like plans that don't necessarily go to plan. They account for change. For example, the OKRs, very flexible, whereas the KPI, you're sort of like setting that structure, and you're not able to be flexible and dynamic the same way that you can be with OKRs.
I think my problem in general with like metrics based kind of goal setting mechanisms it's kind of a couple threads. The first is that it's very hard to make a metric a target without destroying its value as a metric.
Yeah.
If you say to the sales team, I want 100 calls a week,
Yeah.
then they can just call numbers that are not going to pick up. It's not necessarily, it's like a gameable thing, right? You have to be so clever, I think, to set really good metrics that really capture what you want to optimize for as a business. Because the other risk is the general risk with efficiency, which is you can very efficiently optimize something that ends up being useless. So you do something very efficiently that doesn't really provide much value at all.
Good example of that, when I was working as a bouncer at uni, they basically were judging bouncing competence by how many people you kicked out the nightclub that night. And so therefore, the person who did not kick anyone out, they'd be like, well, what were you doing? Like you obviously didn't work hard enough. And I'm like, wait a minute.
I diffuse all the situation.
Yeah, I could have easily diffused those situations, or my presence there was a sort of a deterrent for misbehavior or whatever. But instead, by sort of correlating how many people you kick out with your competence as a bouncer, you're sort of indexing for the wrong thing here. You're actually creating more situations that are going to cause people to have a shit night and more fights than you are trying to encourage good atmosphere, which I thought was a shocking policy for the team.
Yeah, that's not seeing the wood for the trees, let's say.
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe let's transition to a topic that has been kind of playing out behind the scenes, which is the response to Douglas Murray on Joe Rogan. And we're not going to comment necessarily on any of the specific points of that discussion, but more about the discussion itself and the effect that that's had on the discourse, particularly on its relation to expertise and the responsibility that people have when they go on big podcasts and talk about things that maybe the people they're speaking with aren't equipped to rebut. I guess I'll start off with just saying, I don't think it's that ridiculous of a thing to say having been somewhere makes you better equipped to talk about it. Anyone who's spent any kind of amount of time in their life traveling has all come to the same conclusion that there's just no ways you could necessarily know about a place without actually seeing the mechanics of day-to-day life there. And not only that, traveling broadly makes you realize that you can't really generalize about a people very much because you'll just meet so many different characters within any given context. And so, I mean, that's the first point. And that was a weird thing that was being pushed back against it. I think, going somewhere gives you a kind of a perspective that you just have to be there to get. The second point is around the relative cost of saying things that are how do you frame this diplomatically? It's kind of cheap to say things, but it's expensive to rebut things, And if you're going on a podcast and you're not claiming to be any kind of expert, which is a great out, but you're talking about things with the level of kind of candor and in a way vitriol. Maybe vitriol is the wrong word; it's too charged. But you're just interested in it, but you're speaking about it like you know everything about the topic. You kind of can't have it both ways in some sense. And it gets on to kind of Darryl Cooper, who inadvertently or not, kind of ends up literally regurgitating stuff that was straight up Nazi propaganda that's been rebutted in the past. And you need a very skilled person in a way to talk about these things and to, to tiptoe around in a way the edges and kind of feel out the contours in a productive way. That if you're not equipped with the full like armory of knowledge that it would take to rebut all those individual points, which very few people realistically are, and the people that who are, we would probably call experts of some degree. It leads you to basically be overall like a net negative on the progress of the discourse, if you see what I mean. And I love this point that Eric Weinstein makes, which is about it's not enough just to have like the legal right to free speech, but you also have to have a really strong culture around free speech to use it judiciously, because it can't be true that it's fine just to say anything you want at any point in time all the time. Like, you should have the freedom to do that, but you should have the wisdom to use the speech judiciously, and not in such a way that kind of just leads to, you need the speech so you don't get totalitarianism, but you need to use it judiciously so you don't just get like pure unbridled like civic chaos. And it's really a question of like, is sunlight always the best disinfectant? I'll just leave that there as a kind of as a thought.
Yeah, that's what my take on the whole sort of topic around non-experts talking about facts or history or basically things that can be either verifiable or as true or not, but basically the non-experts having their own being able to opine on certain things, and then using the fallback as I'm not an expert to basically be used as a get out of jail free card. And I love that phrase. I don't know if you coined it or if you got it from somewhere when you said it's very cheap to say things but very expensive to sort of take things back. I think that's so true, and it should be true. But what we're finding here is that these sort of pseudo historians like Darryl Cooper and like Dave Smith, who talks obviously a lot about what's going on in the Middle East, how they will basically use the phrase, well, I'm not an expert, I'm not claiming to be an expert on this. They found a very cheap way of basically taking back anything that they've said, but they haven't taken it back. What they're doing is basically repackaging what they're saying and sort of saying, look, I'm not actually trying to say facts here. What I'm trying to say is something completely different. I'm trying to tell a story. I'm trying to communicate something. But the thing that interests me the most is the fact that they think that by claiming not to be an expert or claiming not to be like an historian or a journalist or any of these sort of traditional categories that we would typically associate with people that are saying the same sort of things that they're saying, I actually have greater issue with this, because let's just take an historian as an example. If you're listening to an historian like Andrew Roberts, who's like the most celebrated biographer of Winston Churchill, he is an expert on Winston Churchill, and he knows everything that's happened in his life. And when you hear him talk about Winston Churchill, because you know that he's an historian, you basically remove any sort of preconceptions that he would have some sort of bias towards it. I mean, obviously, there's going to be some bias that you might sense from, the certain stories that he's choosing or not. But there's also a general sense that he's basically he's aiming to be as objective and as truthful as he can be, because he's operating within, and I really want to draw as well, like to what we were talking about earlier about systems and things. He's operating within a system that is the category of like historian, and basically what historians do is they assess the evidence and they listen to different takes or accounts of what's happened in the past, and then they make a conclusion of like, well, what were these people trying to do or aim for? What was the overall objective of these people? And it's all within a very much a framework that we all recognize and that we're all able to sort of understand. And so, you know what a historian is, you know what they do, because that's a typical role that has existed basically forever, and since like Thucydides basically. And what and so we're able to understand Andrew Roberts, and we're able to understand what he's saying about Winston Churchill within this whole wider context that I've just tried to describe. Now you've got someone like Darryl Cooper basically who's saying same things about history. He's telling stories about what happened during the Second World War. But then he says, "Well, I'm not an historian." Then you're like, "Well, whoa! I actually don't have a wider framework. Then I don't have a wider reference framework to actually place the sort of like the detailed things that you're saying in. Because if you're not in this category of historian that sort of looks at things from and tries to be objective with what they're saying and tries to be impartial or tries to give an honest account of certain views and things like that, which we would typically assume an historian was doing, and you're saying that you're not that, then what are you then? And I think,
Yeah.
and the thing that troubles me the most is that, well, actually, there must be an ulterior motive then for why you're saying these things. Because let's look at someone like the History Channel Oversimplified, which
Yeah.
they like huge channel, like very annoyingly they don't release a video very often. It's maybe like once a year they'll do like a video or something. But very like well-known YouTube channel that basically tries to oversimplify that tries to tell a history but in a very oversimplified manner, so very cartoonish, very easy to understand and easy to follow. Now they're going to give an account of history that's very, very different than the account that someone like Andrew Roberts might give, but they claim to be a history channel. Like that's what they are. They're a history channel, and because they're using this word history, and because they're saying that they're a history channel, you're able to easily understand basically the information that they're giving you, even though it's of the different sort of like it's told differently. The stories that they're saying is very oversimplified, and it's very sort of like cartoonish, and maybe it skips over a lot of details. Again, it's operating within this wider framework of history, so that you're able to easily interpret what it is that they're saying. And so the issue that I have with these people like Dave Smith and like Darryl Cooper is that they're operating outside of this whole framework, this traditional framework as what we know as history. So if what they're talking about isn't history, then how is it that we should engage with their content if it's not history? They claim to be a storyteller. Darryl Cooper tells that he's telling stories. Well, then what frame? Then how should I understand?
Is it entertainment?
Is it entertainment or is it not? It's not. I don't think it's purely entertainment, because I've listened to Darryl Cooper and he tries to tell things about what's happened in a non necessarily entertaining way. He's saying them as if, like, look, this is something that you need to understand, or that you should learn about these guys, is that like they're not all as good as they may seem, and that there is some skeletons in their closets. And then when you're sort of bought into that narrative of like he's wanting to give a counter view of something, and he's wanting to give the contrarian version of like what is typically understood in pop culture, then you sort of do look at it with, well, is this alternate history? Is this history that has been put in the shadows and been shielded from us, like everyday humans? But and if it was that, then it would be you'd have an easy sort of like way of categorizing what it is that he's saying. But because he's claiming not to be an historian and claiming not to be under this framework of history, I find it very, very like challenging to basically understand what his motive is then, if it's not to give an accurate view of like what's happened in the past. Maybe I'm taking what he's saying about not being a historian too literally, but I think I have to give him the credit of not. I think I have to like basically use his own words, because he would easily dismiss any comments that he was a historian and that he should be basically held to the same standard as a historian. And I think he's doing two things. One, he's trying to basically move the goalposts. He's trying not to be placed in that category as history, so that he's not held to that standard of being very judicious with the stories and with the accounts that he's telling. But I think deeper and darker is that there's an ulterior motive that he has as to like, why is he trying to take the contrarian stance against like our heroes in the West? And I think that there is a bit of, and this is not me being objective, this is me perhaps sort of projecting or like sort of adding an extra layer on what I see on him. But I do see someone that is very much like angry at our Western heroes that we typically see, like Winston Churchill, and he's upset that people hold them to such high standards and such high, like they admire them a lot. And I don't know, I see a little bit of darkness in what he's doing.
I guess just to put your point back to you, basically what you're saying is, if he's not a historian, what is he actually trying to do with respect to communicating history? Is he trying to come to basically the most well-rounded, well-researched point of what actually happened based on the most amount of evidence? And then by presenting himself as an expert, i.e. going on a podcast and talking about history, but withdrawing the claim that he has any responsibility to like kind of be held to the standard of, I'm trying to seek maximum truth in what I'm doing. Essentially, in a way, just to upgrade your point a little bit here, what he's doing is he's putting the onus on everyone else to fact check and basically verify his claims, as opposed to internalizing that responsibility to say, it is my job to come to like the most accurate point of truth. But the simple fact is most people just don't have the bandwidth to verify everything they hear on every podcast they listen to. And so you're in this like weird point where like they're trying to abdicate the responsibility of, you know, in a way, I guess the most generalizable way you could say this is they're trying to abdicate the responsibility of precise speech, true speech, speech that's worthy of the culture of free speech. And they're saying it's your responsibility. You know, this is in a way just like entertainment. And I think the first people to really do this were the comedians, right? Where if you listen to like, you know, and in a way, like it's true, right? Like if Joe Rogan does something, he's like, I'm just a comedian, I'm just joking around. But I wonder, like, you know, how what's the logical extreme, like the South Park version of this, where you know, you got like a guy like who's like LARPing as a general in the army, and he's like sending people to their death, and he's like, I'm not a soldier, you know, like, or a surgeon who's about to cut someone's brain open and like slices lips. He's like, I'm not a, you know what I mean? Like,
oh, actually, that's an interesting question, because what would you say? How would you describe someone who has learned how to do lobotomies from YouTube and has mastered the art to a degree that he is basically just as skilled as a surgeon that has gone to medical school for, you know, the full term, and he's worked, you know, in a hospital, and he's gone through the proper protocol and proper standards and everything, and but then you've got this other guy who's just learned every single thing from YouTube. He's never stepped a foot inside a university. He never stood inside a hospital. Never done actual, you know, research on the thing or whatsoever. But let's just say you put him, like you put a body in front of him, and he's able to perfectly do lobotomies, and he can repeat it as well. He can do it. He can do brain surgery, you know, without error every single time he's given a case. Would you call him a surgeon?
I don't think that's what Darryl Cooper's doing.
I think I think it's very, very similar to like how people view Darryl Cooper, because I think what Darryl Cooper's saying is that he's not an historian, which basically he's saying, you shouldn't put me in that category because I approach what I read with a very, very different set of principles, basically. And I think that Darryl Cooper's fans, or like people that support him, they basically say that he's this sort of equivalent of, I don't know what you call it, but the surgeon versus the sort of non-surgeon surgeon type thing. Like, I genuinely believe that that's how people view him. They view him as a self-taught historian, and by him saying that he's not an historian, he's basically not saying that he's not telling history. He's not saying that. What he's saying is that I've not gone to university to study history. I'm not a professor in history. I'm not. So you should not hold me to these same standards, or you shouldn't expect me to be like an Andrew Roberts or like Tom Holland or anything. You shouldn't hold me to that standard. Like, don't sort of like critique me in the same ways as you do these other people, because I'm different. I'm self-taught. And his fans are like, well, yeah, you are. Like, you're different. Like you come at it from a different angle. And I think that's what the difference is here.
It's interesting because in my mind, I'm like comparing Darryl Cooper to another person who communicates history while proactively claiming that they're not a historian. which is Dan Carlin. I don't know if you know or listen much to Dan Carlin, but I've listened a lot to Dan Carlin. So some of his series multiple times. Arguably, a lot of what I know about the Roman Empire,
Yeah.
about kind of Caesar and that whole kind of period of history, the kind of collapse of the Roman Empire, is from Dan Carlin's podcast. Same with the Mongolians. Fantastic podcasts. His method is basically to read like 7, 8 books on a topic, and then communicate the facts such as they are in the most entertaining way possible. I would argue Dan Carlin's quite an orator, and listening to his podcast is almost like a return to the oral tradition. Sitting around a campfire for millennia, human beings would hear the stories of their ancestors over and over again. You listen to the podcast over and over again. And I mean, the difference is no like kind of variation because it's a recording, but it's kind of like a return to that type of history. I think the difference in what the claim "I'm not a historian" is doing with Dan Carlin versus Darryl Cooper is Dan Carlin is saying, take everything I say with a pinch of salt. This may change. I'm not the best person to necessarily assess in good faith any of the claims that I'm making. I'm just a massive fan of history, and it's my job to communicate this in the most entertaining way possible. What Darryl Cooper's doing, in a way, because you can't say he's doing it for entertainment value only, is what he's saying is, I don't want to take any responsibility for the claims that I'm making necessarily. Does that kind of like resonate with you?
Sounds like what Dan Carlin is doing is that he's making it no secret about what's going on in his brain and like what his objective is and what he's aiming to do with what he's saying, and he's also making it. He's sort of like overqualifying what he's saying with like, oh, by the way, like, please do your own research, and like these are the texts that I've read. Obviously, like those texts themselves might have some inherent bias in them as well, and so on. So he's very much trying to give as much context and as much information to his listener or to his watcher to allow them to make a decision for himself. Where maybe the difference between that and Darryl Cooper is he's made the decision for you of like what the intentions were of whoever he's speaking about, and he's basically packaging it up and basically giving you a sort of package and not really allowing you to sort of work out for yourself what to do with the information he's given you. He's basically giving you sort of pre-packaged ideas.
This kind of leads me on to the next question. How do you feel about the claim that if you have a platform, you therefore have responsibility due to the reach of that platform?
Yeah, I think that with power with power comes influence, and with the ability to influence comes responsibility. I think that you can't have an immense power or an immense capability of being able to influence minds without having some degree of responsibility for how you're being able to influence minds. And I think that that's basically what we're seeing now with these podcasts, is that they've grown so big, that they've amassed so much power, that I think it's about time that we start talking about it, in governments, about like actually how do we regulate podcasts in a way that they can't sort of spin off to like very
Do you really think that? Because that is the core of this free speech argument, right? This is what I was saying at the beginning. You can't like regulate speech in that way without treading down the garden path to basically totalitarianism, right? Who's the central commissar regulating what podcasts are allowed to go out? What you need is like a strong sense of like civic duty. It's the only way you can regulate speech is the culture around it. You cannot make it a top-down regulation. It has to be a bottom-up spirit of what is a responsible way to use this right that has been very expensive for my ancestors to acquire for me. And just to exonerate Churchill somewhat here, there's a quote he gave I've been listening to the Andrew Roberts audiobook recently, and I have to throw in some Churchill here because the person we're talking about, but was giving a speech to Harvard University in 1944, and it was addressing some of the isolationists in the US, and basically the people who were reticent for the US to step into the shoes of global hegemony. And what he said is, one thing he said is, you cannot become the ruler of the world without taking an interest in what happens in all the various parts of it, because by definition, it will have to affect you. And the second point that he said, which I think is very relevant for our discussion here, is the price of greatness is responsibility, right?
Yeah.
And you cannot have one without the other.
Yeah. I think when I was talking about regulations when it comes to podcasts and like government regulations, I wasn't necessarily talking about speech. I was basically talking about the podcasts themselves. So an example of that would basically be, you can't, let's just say YouTube created categories of podcasts, and they had entertainment, and they had a history, and they had, whatever. There'd have to be some sort of regulation that basically said you can't have a podcast that is clearly not history in the history podcast. In the history category, because that is misleading people. And it could actually have the potential to mislead hundreds of millions of people into believing that something that is just a fantasy or a fiction is actually non-fiction. And I think that podcast industry is going to be so big that it's much larger than the legacy media has ever been, because obviously, like, we're growing as a population, but also we're, well, not necessarily as an entire population, but the amount of people that are adopting technology is growing, and obviously that means that I think I don't know if you would agree with this, but I do believe that the potential for where podcasting can go as in terms of its influence on being able to share news updates will be bigger than what the legacy media has ever been able to achieve. I think that trend is going, and so I think that there's going to have to be, in the same way that news is regulated, I think that podcasting industry is going to have to be regulated. But that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm wanting to regulate what people can and can't say on podcasts. And I think that what a regulation is, and I just want to tie this back to actually what you said about project management or about efficient bureaucracies, is basically that the reason why you need project management structure is because the best way for a project to work basically is, like, imagine you get like 3 of the most competent people in the workplace, and you basically say, hey, figure out this thing. I want you to roll out this project in like 3 months. And they basically were like, okay, what should we do? Well, we need to speak to these people. We need to make sure that they're bought in. We need to create an objective. We need to create deliverables. We need to do all this. And then we need to create a timeline. And then we need to make sure that we've got all these stakeholders bought in. And then we need to like create actionable steps and blah, blah, blah. Like, they're doing all this sort of intuitive things that in order to get this project sort of like delivered on time and executed efficiently. Now, what someone would do if they were in the back of that room with a notepad is write every single thing that they're doing, and they would basically create a project management framework. And they would say, okay, well, what they did was they did stakeholder identification. Okay, that's the first thing that they're doing. And then what they're doing, they're creating a project. Well, they did the objectives, and then they said what their goals are, and then they said what deliverables they want. Okay, let's create this thing called the project charter, where you write down what you want to achieve and all that. And they're basically, what they're doing retrospectively is creating a framework as to like what worked in that project and how they were able to deliver that efficiently. They're making that into a sort of formula, or like a sort of structure that is scalable and replicable, so that other people who aren't as competent as them to figure it out for themselves are able to follow the step-by-step playbook in order to carry out the project efficiently. That was basically what that was a sort of steel man for like a bureaucracy, essentially, and a very sort of like generalist like point of view of like, why do you need structure in companies? Built for that reason, so that those who are less competent than the competent ones are able to work just as efficiently. And basically tying this to what we're talking about in podcast world is, we need to basically figure out what the best podcasts and what the best platforms are doing at the moment in order to make sure that they're not misleading their audience, and make sure that they're giving honest information, make sure that they've got the best of each side of a different argument on their podcast to share their different points of views. And then we're going to have to basically look at what are the most competent people doing in this industry, and we're going to have to like learn from them. And then we're going to have to create regulation or create structure around what they're doing, and then implement that into the industry so that any two sort of people that are starting a podcast who aren't competent, that don't really know what to do with the responsibility or the influence or power that they're amassing by their sort of by how good their podcast is, and that they're able to operate within this framework so that they don't have to think too much about actually how do I cope with all this power and all this influence that I've got, and this means I've got so much responsibility, that actually the framework's there to allow them to prosper without thinking too much. And I think that's what regulation does by its nature, is that it's what good regulation does by its nature, is that it should naturally fit into the way that people want things to be done in a very natural way that sort of optimizes for growth, and that optimizes for prosperity, that optimizes for for those things. I don't know if you see my the where I'm trying to get to, but I think there will be a point where there's going to be regulation there, but it's not going to be bad regulation. It's going to be regulation that is influenced, that's going to be derived from what the most competent people at the top of their game have shown works, and that is replicable and scalable, just the same way that the top performers in the company set the standard for how things are delivered and carried out. It's going to be the same in the podcast world, I believe, as well.
I think it's probably a good place to kind of leave the discussion. So look, this has been fun. Just jumping on one evening, just chatting about whatever's on our mind. From Prussian marching orders to podcast regulation. As always, pretty wide-ranging discussion. So cheers, man.
Never had a conversation with you.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, do we just do a quick intro as well, just while we got the recording? Because we kind of just started the recording.
Yeah.